Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. This week, we're going to take up the report issued by LRN last week, I believe, their annual Program Effectiveness Report. Matt, you wrote about this, and what were some of the sort of things that intrigued you, and what did you see that you...
Tom, as you mentioned, the LRN puts out this report every spring or late winter, and it came out earlier this month, February. Big survey of more than 1,500 people, a mix of ethics and compliance professionals and other employees at companies. And they are trying to get a sense of what corporate culture looks like. And look, let's be honest, LRN is selling compliance services. So they're trying to draw a distinction between high impact, high performing programs and other programs. And of course, if you want a high program, then you should work with compliance software vendors such as LRN. Take this with a grain of salt, but it does also include a lot of interesting snippets about how people view the ethical culture at their organizations. And that is important for compliance officers to think about. So the report is definitely worth your time to give it a read. But Tom, the one thing that jumped out to me is that LRN has documented, and for a couple of years running now, they have been documenting this, that there is a wide and growing disconnect about the perceptions of ethical culture in the organization. And basically, the higher up you are, the better you think the corporate culture is, while everybody beneath you thinks, no, actually, the culture is not all that it's cracked up to be, and there are a lot of shortcomings. So we have this gulf, this perception gap between the senior executives who think everything is ethical, we make great decisions, and everybody else who's like, nope, you are not, sir. And we have a lot of problems. And that's what people further down the org chart think, according to LRN. And there's a lot that compliance officers could ponder there. That's why this report caught my eye.
So that sets the basic framework, Matt. How can now a compliance officer begin to not simply unpack that information you just related, but maybe take a look at their organization to see, number one, if that's a problem, and then hopefully move to remedial steps. But how would you actually assess that disconnect?
I think it is a good point to remind everybody that, yes, I think this disconnect is real. I think what LRN has documented here is legit. And they have shown that it is a significant gap, and it's been growing for years. For example, the spread between senior executives who think we make difficult decisions in conjunction with our values and purpose, senior executives who think that versus everybody else. 5 years ago, that spread was 85 for senior executives, 62% for everybody else. Now, 2025, it is 79% of executives who say, yes, we're still upholding our ethical values. 37% of companies who say no, of everybody else who is saying, no, we're not. So that gulf has widened. LRN did mention the fact that when it was closer several years ago, that was during the pandemic. And we should keep in mind that there was a sort of rally around each other sentiment during the pandemic in its early years. That's a good thing to have happen. And it's important to remember it. But anyways, long story short is overall, this gulf is there and it's significant. But the first thing you as a compliance officer should remember is just because that gulf generally exists, it might exist in your company in a different way. It might be narrower, might be wider. I don't know. But just because LRN says that this gulf now, the spread is 79% versus 37% for senior execs versus everybody else, might be very different at your own company. So yes, you should take the time to invest and figure out what is that actual gulf at my own organization. So you should be thinking about how you could work with maybe the HR team and dig up data that would help answer these questions about, do people really believe that the company lives up to its ethical values? Do people believe that senior executives are held to the same standards as everybody else? And again, senior executives say yes, everybody else says no. But how would you figure that out? What's the data you'd want to look at? Probably a lot of stuff from employee sentiment surveys, probably a lot of data that might be gleaned from exit interviews. And Tom, I know you're a big fan of the information that can be gleaned from exit interviews. I am sure if you want to work with an outside expert, an LRN, I think would be happy to have those conversations. You could have some firm out there help you dig into it. But that's the very first question is, how do we get a sense of how big this gulf is ourselves? Once you then diagnose how big this gap is, you still have to think about where that comes from. We can talk a bit about that, but LRN had some possible likely causes of this as well. Perceived favoritism among the workforce, that superstars or senior executives and CEOs get better treatment than everybody else. A lack of transparency into the decision-making process. I think that is a very good, rich thread to pull on. How much transparency into decision-making do employees have? Which ones have how much transparency? And then a limited involvement in what the policies or ethical values and practices of the company are, a limited involvement of the frontline employees, which I thought was another really good observation. We talk all the time about talking about the first line of executives or first line business functions. CCOs should talk with them. Yes, they should. But that's just reaching across the org chart, not reaching down the org chart. And that's another dimension that CCOs would want to think about.
Matt, it strikes me in listening to you, or at least it raises a question for me, that just the findings that you've detailed that you saw in this year's LRN report, could that be a lack of a safe environment, a lack of a safe space, a lack of employees feeling like they could tell the truth and not be punished or not be sanctioned?
I mean, ultimately, I think yes, because when you're talking about lack of a safe space, or to use the cliche, really what we're talking about is a lack of trust. I, low-level employee, don't trust that if I speak up, the company will treat me fairly or will hold that senior person I know something about, will hold him or her accountable. I don't trust that they have my best interests at heart. And if we just said lack of trust, I think a lot of HR and compliance people would say, yeah, that is a problem at a large organization. It's quite common. But Tom, you're really breaking it down into what is that lack of trust really about? It is about feeling like you can't safely raise a concern, or you can't speak your mind freely, or something like that. There's a lot of overlap between fear of being able to do something and mistrust or distrust that if I do something, I'm going to get my hand slapped, so I shouldn't put my hand forth at all. We could talk a bit more about what the safe spaces are, or what are the practices that you could do to make employees feel safe. But really, that's just a different way of saying that they'll trust the corporate culture and they'll trust senior management. I see those as two sides of the same coin. It's an excellent point to raise.
Matt, I think the first, or at least one of the points you raised on building a stronger culture was clear and consistent disciplinary actions. And in 2020, the Department of Justice, through its 2020 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, for the first time articulated that they believe the CCO should be the holder of the flames of both institutional justice and institutional fairness. How could typically those had been seen in the past, at least in part under the purview of HR. How can a compliance officer work with HR to have both justice, meaning a process that everyone understands, one and two, and then fairness, which is that process will be implemented consistently for all?
I definitely think that this is about transparency into the process. You could, for example, have the CCO and the HR director work together to come up with a defined process. And I actually think that is a big problem for a lot of companies, is you don't have a very well-defined process or any process for discipline. Even if you reach the right conclusion and give the right disciplinary action, if there isn't any clear sense of how we got from point A of allegation to point Z of the disciplinary action, if we don't sketch out the B, C, D all the way down to X, Y, Z steps, employees are going to wonder, how did we get there? And I don't know how they got there. And therefore, maybe I should just stand back, work to develop that process. I personally think it would be great to give some hypothetical examples, complete with hypothetical facts about the types of misconduct that you are likely to see at your organization, and then let employees see and study that and understand this is how we took this fact pattern and squared it with these values and priorities we have to get this disciplinary result. It is kind of like a math equation to that extent, and you should be able to follow the equation from the first variable to the last. So I think that there is a lot around there. And then secondly, it is a lot about record keeping, frankly. And think about how many of these ephemeral messaging enforcement actions that we saw over the last couple of years from the Securities and Exchange Commission. And I get it. We're not going to do enforcement of ephemeral messaging anymore. I know who's in the White House. I know we're not doing that. But go back to what those enforcement actions actually directed companies to do. Meticulous record keeping about who received what enforcement action at what level of seniority. And they basically wanted to draw out a pattern of if you are a more senior person who should know better, you would get a harsher infraction. If you are a more low-level person who might not understand the full grasp or consequences of what you're doing, you'd get a lesser enforcement. Or somebody who's new and has never done this before versus somebody who is senior or experienced and a veteran and who has had 3 or 4 infractions in the past, that kind of thing. You need to track all of that so that you can see that the single clear disciplinary process I sketched out before, that disciplinary process holds true at scale for a wide range of people and offenses and seniority levels and experience with the company and its disciplinary actions, all of that. You cannot have that visibility at scale without a lot of meticulous record keeping. And I know that's boring. I know it's a drag, but nonetheless, you're not going to have people buying into the disciplinary process without that kind of transparency and visibility. Transparency means you have data you can point to when somebody says, I want to understand how you got here. There's the data. Here's our process. You can put 2 and 2 together. You'll come up with 4 just like we did. That's the sort of thing that wins trust.
Matt, you also talked about having frontline employees involved in policy and control design. Is that something along the lines of greater employee engagement so they'll be somewhat invested in the process, or do you see something else going on there?
It is a lot like that. And think about it. If we were going to say the CCO should talk with the vice president of sales about what a good travel and entertainment policy should be and what a good process to report T&E expenses should look like. If we just said that with the head of sales, nobody would blink an eye. Yeah, that all makes perfect sense. We should do it. There is no real reason why you could not also, at least to some extent, involve some of the lower level people. And I think those low level sales agents would really appreciate it. The VP of sales, if they were smart, would probably want to bring their underlings on board with this effort and just ask them, what do you think of this? Here's what we're going to do. And this is regulatory compliance. You can show up and tell them, this is what we have to achieve at the end. Even if you don't like it, even if you think that's boring and it sucks, the law is the law. We got to do this. But we could do it in any number of ways. What is a good way to do it in your position from 4 rungs down the organizational ladder? So, Tom, I have to admit that I wrote that out and I put a little note in my post that if anybody wanted to share examples of have they done that, I'd be eager to hear it. And 1 or 2 people did. Compliance officers who said that they can see where this works reasonably well at a smaller company, a CCO who said that they had, I think it was less than 500 people at their organization. But this CCO said, yes, I often will go out to the rank and file employees and tell them, this is the objective we have to achieve. This is what me and your boss think probably could work. What do you think of it? This is the policy we want. This is the procedure we want. I think consulting low-level employees on procedure would be really helpful. I think consulting them on policy might be a bit of a stretch because ultimately they don't get to make the policy, but you could at least tell them this is the policy that we're thinking of. It's going to have to point in this direction. It's going to have to get to that far point on the horizon over there. That's the law. How do you think about this? And over communicate with those employees because that brings up that issue of lack of transparency that LRN had flagged. Involving other people is a great way to bring that transparency to light, and that's a good thing.
And then I think the final point you raised was having a CCO who would actually go out and meet people or engage with people or try to humanize themselves. Is this, now that many companies are moving to at least more return to work, if not full time, is this a situation of a lunch alone? Is a lunch wasted? Or is it more town halls? Is it more meeting with small groups? Is it all of the above, none of the above?
I mean, I think it's all of the above, including a lunch alone from time to time, so you don't go completely insane and you can have some solitude and peace from time to time. But absolutely, compliance officers should ideally be somewhat gregarious people who are out there holding town halls, holding meetings with different groups. I can appreciate that a big town hall, you're probably not going to be able to organize that unless your CEO has given his or her blessing to be able to command the time and attention of a large group of employees. But certainly meeting with department heads or sitting in on a department meeting and say, this is what I'm here to do. This is what the company's required to do. We can either do this by my way, but I would prefer to do it in a way that is reflective of your reality. Let's work together. Like, that's common sense. And frankly, for most compliance officers I know, they are fairly gregarious people who do like to do that. And they should be able to do it as much as possible. Or if you can't travel, then we could talk about the compliance ambassadors and local champions and all that stuff that we've talked about before. But fundamentally, it's about building a community buy-in for your ethics and compliance program, the culture you want to achieve. Any way you can do that is fine.
And I'd like to have as our last conversation on this podcast, maybe circling back a little bit to where we started, which is this disconnect, and either look down the road or speculate if LRN continues to have these kinds of findings. Is it really going to portend something that could be certainly negative for compliance down the road?
I don't know that it would be negative for compliance per se. I do think that these gulfs would be negative for corporate performance overall, that the less involved, the more distinct and separate the rank and file feel from the senior executive officers. I don't think that's a good idea at all. And look, maybe the senior executives who say, oh yeah, everything's great, we're so ethical at our company. Maybe you are out to lunch, but that doesn't mean that you don't see this as a problem. I think a lot of senior executives would be very uncomfortable with that finding, and they do want to make sure that they have the same perceptions of the corporate culture as everybody else. And I would worry about that more than anything else. And if I were a compliance officer, I would go to the CEO and say, there is this gulf. It does exist. I don't know how much it exists at our company, but I'm sure you don't want to be more isolated and clueless about what's going on at the organization than anybody else. Every single smart CEO would say, absolutely, plug me in. How can we figure out how this gulf exists at our business? How wide is it? How could we close it? There's a compelling argument to make there. And if you have a CEO who says, couldn't care less, you should get out of there just because that sounds like a crappy place to work. Compliance or regulatory issues or not. That's all.
Matt, I want to shout out to LRN for this year's annual report. I've worked with LRN on this report over the years. I've worked to communicate some of the findings, the report, as well through the podcast format. And it's a great resource for the compliance community. I hope our listeners will click through the link you put in your in your blog post. We'll put that in the podcast as well and read the entire report. It's much worthwhile, a great read.
Thank
So
you.
Matt, till next week.